The air in the courtroom hummed with quiet tension, papers rustling, whispered conversations weaving through the gallery, the distant thud of a gavel echoing from another chamber. Judge Victoria Lane sat tall, her robe draped neatly over her shoulders, her expression calm and measured. Another case, another name on the docket. Just another day in court, or so she thought. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. The state of Texas versus Lucas Reed. Victoria barely reacted, her fingers tracing the polished mahogany of the bench as she glanced at the case file. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. The weight of it settled in her chest, heavy, familiar. Another lost soul caught in the system, another life teetering on the edge. But when the defendant stepped forward, shackles clinking against the floor, everything changed. This wasn't just another case, this was personal. But then the doors opened, and everything shifted. The man being led into the courtroom, shackled at the wrists and ankles, wasn't just another defendant. He was Lucas Reed, her Lucas. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as memories came rushing back with startling clarity. The scorching Texas summers spent chasing fireflies in the fields behind their childhood homes. The whispered conversations on the old wooden swig outside his grandmother's house. The unbreakable vow they made as kids to always stand by each other, no matter what. But the man before her wasn't the boy she remembered. His broad shoulders sagged under an invisible weight, his face etched with lines of hardship and regret. And yet, his eyes, those deep, familiar, storm gray eyes, hadn't changed. Victoria's grip on the gavel wavered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter as she struggled to process the impossible. Lucas lifted his head, his expression a tangled mix of shock and quiet acceptance. Recognition flared in his eyes, but only for a fleeting second before he quickly averted his gaze, his shoulders drawing inward. The courtroom held its breath, waiting. Victoria forced herself to speak. "Mr. Reed, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" Lucas's voice was rough, like gravel scraped against concrete. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her pulse pounded against her ribs. She wanted to stop everything, to demand answers. What happened to him? How had their lives unraveled so differently? But she couldn't, not here, not now. She straightened in her seat, gripping the bench like an anchor. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The prosecutor stood, launching into their opening statement, but Victoria barely heard a word. Her mind was somewhere else, somewhere far from the gavel in her hand and the black robes on her shoulders. She and Lucas had grown up on opposite ends of Amarillo, Texas, not separated by miles, but by invisible lines drawn long before either of them were born. Victoria's childhood home was a modest, single-story house with a white picket fence, the kind that belonged on a postcard. Lucas's family lived at the end of a dusty back road, their weathered house standing alone, surrounded by fields that stretched toward the horizon. Their friendship had been an anomaly, an unspoken defiance of the world they were born into. She still remembered the day they met, an accidental encounter at the creek where she had wandered too far from her own backyard. Lucas had been fishing, his line hopelessly tangled in the reeds. She'd offered to help, and that small act had unraveled into years of secret adventures and whispered dreams. "Victoria," he had once said, lying beside her in the cool grass, staring up at the Texas sky, endless and full of stars. "You ever think about leaving this place? I mean, really getting out. Going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together." She had laughed then, brushing off the idea, but Lucas wasn't joking. Even as a kid, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond deepened despite the hushed whispers, the side-eyed glances, the unspoken rules that had been carved into the town long before they were born. But the weight of it was always there, pressing down, waiting to crush them. And then, one day, it did. It was the summer before high school when everything changed. Her father caught them sitting together on the porch, their laughter dissolving the moment his heavy footsteps echoed against the wooden planks. His voice was sharp, edged with something deeper than just authority. "Victoria, inside. now. She had hesitated, her pulse pounding as she looked at Lucas. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, as if he already knew this was the beginning of the end. "Go on," Lucas had said, his voice quiet, tinged with something heavier than disappointment acceptance. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other again, not really. Her father made sure of that. From that night forward, Victoria was forbidden from going near Lucas Reed. And just like that, the boy who had once been her closest friend became a ghost. A few weeks later, his family packed up and left town. Victoria buried herself in school, in ambition, in a future that stretched far beyond the dusty roads of Amarillo. Law school, the bar exam, the long, grueling hours that shaped her into the woman she was now. A woman who believed in justice, in fairness. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her what real courage looked like. Now, seated behind the bench, she stared at the man who had once been that boy. What had happened to Lucas after she walked away? His record offered only a fragmented glimpse: minor offenses, petty theft, trespassing, loitering. Nothing that screamed danger, nothing that pointed to the kind of person who should be shackled in a courtroom. But a few lines on a rap sheet could never tell the whole story. The prosecutor's voice cut through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. Lucas was accused of robbing a convenience store in Fort Worth. The store clerk claimed he had been assaulted, though the injuries were minor. The register had been emptied, and Lucas was picked up just a few blocks away, the alleged stolen cash still in his possession. Victoria studied him as the prosecutor spoke. His shoulders slumped, his hands clasped in front of him, but his face gave nothing away. Did he really do it, or was this another case of the system failing someone who had never been given a fair chance? When the court adjourned for a lunch break, Victoria exhaled slowly, trying to collect her thoughts. But as she made her way back to her chambers, her assistant, Rachel, was already waiting, her expression cautious. "Judge Lane," Rachel said carefully, "are you okay? You seemed a little distracted in there." Victoria hesitated. Should she tell her? Should she admit that she knew the defendant, that she once knew him better than anyone? Instead, she offered a tight-lipped smile. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be, when the past she had buried so deeply was now sitting just a few feet away, waiting for her judgment? By the time the trial resumed, the courtroom was packed. Reporters hunched over notepads, pens scratching furiously. The clerk shuffled papers. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named David Calloway, stood ready to deliver his opening argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Calloway began, his voice measured and unwavering, "this case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, assaulted an innocent clerk before stealing from the register. The evidence will show that Lucas Reed is guilty." Victoria felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical, detached, as if Lucas were nothing more than a statistic, a case number on a docket. She risked a glance at him. He sat motionless, his gaze locked on the table before him, unreadable. Then the defense attorney, Madison Clark, stood. She was young but composed, her confidence evident in the way she carried herself. When she spoke, her voice filled the room with quiet authority. "The prosecution wants you to believe this case is simple," she said, pacing slowly before the jury. "But it's not. My client, Lucas Reed, has maintained his innocence from the very beginning. And we intend to show you why the assumptions made on the night of his arrest don't hold up under scrutiny." The first witness was called to the stand, the store clerk who had been working that night. He described the suspect entering, arguing with the cashier, and then lunging over the counter. His testimony was crisp, detailed, but something about it felt too rehearsed. When Madison rose for cross-examination, she was methodical, deliberate. She adjusted her glasses and fixed the witness with a steady gaze. "Mr. Chambers," she said smoothly, "you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie, correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. Madison took a step closer. "Did you see his face clearly?" The clerk hesitated. "Not really." "It was dark, and he had the hood up. Madison nodded, pacing slightly. So, just to clarify, you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault? Well, no, the witness admitted. Madison didn't give him a chance to backpedal. No further questions, she said, her tone crisp as she turned back toward the defense table. Victoria noticed Lucas shift slightly in his seat. His shoulders squared, his posture straighter just enough to suggest that, for the first time since the trial began, a sliver of hope had crept in. The next piece of evidence was the surveillance footage. The prosecutor queued up the grainy, poorly lit video from the store's security camera. The jury leaned forward as the black and white clip played on the screen. A figure in a red hoodie entered the store, moved quickly toward the counter, and then just as the alleged assault was supposed to occur, the frame blurred, the motion indistinct. The suspect disappeared off screen. David Calloway, the prosecutor, gestured toward the screen. Ladies and gentlemen, this is clear proof. You can see the suspect grab at the register. Objection, Madison interjected smoothly. What we see is a shadowy figure. No defining characteristics, no face, just a hoodie. A red hoodie does not equal guilt. Victoria studied the footage, her fingers tightening around the edge of her bench. Could this really be Lucas? His defense hinged on an alibi. He claimed he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. But there was a problem. The friend refused to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Madison did her best to spin it. Just because no one is willing to speak up for my client doesn't mean he's guilty. But Victoria could see the jury's faces. They weren't convinced. They wanted something more. As the trial wore on, the weight of her position pressed heavier on her shoulders. She was supposed to be impartial. A pillar of fairness, a judge, not a person. But how could she be when every moment in this courtroom dragged her back to the past? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom. And she was the one tasked with deciding his fate. When the court adjourned for the day, Victoria lingered at the bench, her fingers lightly tracing the smooth edges of the gavel. She wanted to talk to Lucas. She wanted to ask him directly, privately, what had happened. But she couldn't. Any contact outside the courtroom would jeopardize not just the case, but her career. As the bailiffs moved to escort him out, shackles clinking softly against the marble floor, she felt her resolve waver. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to untangle truth from deception. But for the first time, she questioned whether truth was something the system could ever truly grasp. The next day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The defense was about to present its case, and Madison Clark called her first key witness, Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. Victoria straightened in her seat. If there were any cracks in the prosecution's case, this was where they would show. Officer Harris, a stocky man with a square jaw and the air of someone who had seen it all, took the stand. He adjusted his uniform as he settled into the chair. Madison approached him, her expression cool, her tone measured. "Officer Harris," she began, "you were the one who arrested my client, correct?" "That's right," he said, his voice clipped and professional. Madison paced slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough before she continued. "You stated in your report that Mr. Reed was walking to blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And what led you to believe he was the suspect?" Harris shifted in his seat. "He matched the description: black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing." Madison's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. "Dark clothing," she turned, glancing toward the jury. "But the suspect in the surveillance footage was described as wearing a red hoodie." Harris's jaw tightened. "Yeah, but he could have ditched it." Madison let the words hang in the air for a moment before pressing forward. "Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Reed's possession when you searched him?" A beat of silence. "No," Harris admitted. Madison took a step closer. "Could have?" She repeated, her tone sharp. "Did you or any other officer conduct a search of the surrounding area to locate this supposed hoodie?" Harris's jaw tightened. "No, we didn't have time." He was apprehended quickly. Madison pressed on, relentless. So, to clarify, you arrested my client based on a vague description, without any physical evidence linking him to the scene? The officer's silence stretched. The tension in the courtroom thickened. Victoria's gaze flickered to the jury. A few members exchanged uncertain glances. But Madison wasn't done. She took another step, her voice unwavering. Officer Harris, do you recall if Mr. Reed said anything at the time of his arrest? Harris exhaled sharply. He protested. He admitted. Said he was innocent. Madison tilted her head. And did you consider investigating his claim? Or did you assume guilt based solely on his appearance? Harris's face reddened. I followed protocol. Protocol? Madison repeated, arching an eyebrow. No further questions, Your Honor. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom as Harris stepped down, his credibility visibly shaken. Victoria's heart pounded. This was more than just a trial now. This was a reckoning not just for Lucas, but for a system that seemed all too willing to condemn him. And then the defense made its move. Your Honor, Madison announced, the defense calls Dr. Stephen Patel, a forensic analyst. A middle-aged man in a dark suit took the stand, adjusting his glasses as he sat. The courtroom leaned in. This was unexpected. Dr. Patel, you've reviewed the surveillance footage from the night in question, correct? Madison asked. Yes, Patel confirmed. And based on my analysis, there are inconsistencies. Explain. Patel glanced at the jury before continuing. First, based on the height and build of the individual in the footage, there is no definitive way to confirm that it was Mr. Reed. The quality is too poor for a reliable identification. Madison nodded. And what else did you find? Patel took a breath. The timestamp on the footage has been altered. A wave of hushed gasps swept through the room. David Calloway, the prosecutor, shot up from his seat. Objection. Speculative. Madison held her ground. Dr. Patel, are you speculating? No, Patel answered firmly. The metadata from the footage shows that the timestamp was modified after the fact. This raises questions about its reliability. Victoria glanced toward the jury. Their expressions had shifted, uncertainty creeping in where there had once been confidence. A shadow of doubt now loomed over the prosecution's case. And as the day drew to a close, that doubt settled into the air like a storm waiting to break. Lucas was given the opportunity to testify on his own behalf. Madison had warned him of the risks, how anything he said could be twisted, how juries didn't always listen to men like him the way they should. But Lucas insisted. He rose from his chair, the soft clinking of chains the only sound in the hushed courtroom. When he sat down in the witness stand, he exhaled slowly. His voice, though quiet, carried a raw sincerity that filled the room. I've made mistakes, Lucas began, looking directly at the jury. I've taken wrong turns. I've trusted the wrong people, but I didn't do this. He swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the edges of the stand. That night, I was just walking home, minding my own business. The cops stopped me, and they didn't ask questions. They just saw me and decided I fit the bill. His voice cracked slightly. I've been fighting my whole life, fighting to be seen as more than what people assume about me. But this ... he shook his head. I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. When Lucas sat back down, the weight of his words lingered in the air. This wasn't just about one night. This was a plea not just for justice, but for humanity. She glanced at the jury. Their faces were a mixture of doubt, empathy, and something else, uncertainty. The final day of the trial arrived heavy with anticipation. The closing arguments were delivered with precision. David Calloway, the prosecutor, stood first, his voice even, his tone controlled. He leaned on the circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the process. Ladies and gentlemen, the facts remain. The defendant was near the scene. The clerk identified him. We have to believe in the system, and the system tells us Lucas Reed is guilty. Then Madison rose, her presence steady yet impassioned. She didn't pace or raise her voice. She let the silence between her words work for her. The prosecution asks you to trust the system, she said, looking each juror in the eye. But what if the system is wrong? A beat of silence. We've seen the cracks in this case. We've seen the inconsistencies, the rush to judgment, the missing evidence. And now, I ask you, is that enough? Is that enough to take a man's freedom? She let the question hang in the air. Then, quietly, she finished. We don't ask for sympathy. We ask for fairness. And fairness means looking beyond assumptions. It means seeing the person before you, not just the case file. Victoria listened intently, her face unreadable, but her mind racing. Her role was clear. She couldn't sway the jury. She couldn't tell them what to believe. But if their verdict left room for doubt, room for injustice, then she would have the final word. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. Justice was not just about law, it was about truth. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom emptied and refilled as people stretched their legs, whispered among themselves, speculated about the outcome. Lucas sat motionless at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He hadn't looked at Victoria since the first day of the trial, and she couldn't blame him. What could she possibly say to make any of this better? Finally, the bailiff stepped forward. All rise. The room fell silent as the jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. The foreperson stood, gripping a single sheet of paper with trembling hands. Victoria inhaled slowly, steadying herself. In the case of the state of Texas versus Lucas Reed, a pause, too long, too unbearable. We find the defendant, another beat. The world seemed to shrink, not guilty. The courtroom erupted, gasps, murmurs, a few scattered cheers. Victoria tapped her gavel sharply. Order. The noise settled, but the weight in the room didn't lift. Lucas's shoulders sagged, as if the invisible chains that had bound him for weeks, maybe years, had finally been released. But his face remained unreadable. This was his freedom, but it had come at a cost. Victoria cleared her throat, forcing her voice to remain steady. The jury has spoken. Mr. Reed, you are free to go. Court is adjourned. The final rap of her gavel echoed through the chamber, final and absolute. As the courtroom emptied, Victoria lingered behind. She watched as Lucas signed his release paperwork, his movements slow, deliberate. He had spent so long being treated as a prisoner. How did someone just go back to being free? For a moment, she thought he might walk away without a word. And maybe that would have been easier. But then he turned. The room was nearly empty now. The jury had gone. Reporters had filed out. Only a few clerks remained, tidying up. Rachel, her assistant, was gathering files at the desk. Lucas stopped a few feet from the bench, his expression guarded. "You don't owe me anything," Lucas said quietly, his voice steady, but laced with something deeper, something raw. "But I'd like to know why. Why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Victoria felt her throat tighten. The words caught before she could force them out. "Because I couldn't," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had to be fair. If I'd said something, it might have jeopardized the case." Lucas studied her, his expression unreadable, a mix of hurt, understanding, and something else. "Fair," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. He let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "That's the thing, Victoria. The world's never been fair, not for people like me." She dropped her gaze to the polished wood of the bench, her fingers tightening into a fist. "You're right," she admitted. "I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." Lucas exhaled, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "We were kids," he said. "We didn't know any better." "But you know now, don't you?" Victoria lifted her head, her voice steady as she spoke. "I do." A pause, then, softer, "And I'm sorry." Lucas held her gaze for a long moment before giving a small nod. He said nothing more. With quiet resolve, he turned and walked away, disappearing through the courthouse doors, swallowed by the fading light. Alone in the empty courtroom, Victoria felt the weight of it all, his words, the verdict, the unshakable truth settling over her like an anchor. She had followed the law, played by the rules, done everything she was supposed to, but justice was more than just procedures and rulings. It was about the people, the lives reduced to case numbers in a system that often failed to see them at all. This trial had changed her. It was a reckoning she couldn't ignore. Stepping outside, the last golden rays of sunlight stretched long across the courthouse steps. The world continued on, indifferent and unyielding. Yet, something within her had shifted. She couldn't rewrite the past, but she could fight for what came next. It wouldn't be easy. It might never be enough. But for Lucas, for herself, she had to try.